Let's see if we can run through this quickly because I'm tired of having this conversation over and over again. Recently on book Twitter, there has been a sort of discussion about whether or not white authors should get to write characters of color, specifically main characters and, side characters. This is a nuanced discussion with so many perspectives, but I would just, simply like to give my opinion as an African girl who grew up consuming Western media and frankly speaking, not, really getting the representation I needed when I was growing up. What actually motivated me to make a video on the topic was that I recently watched a Read with Cindy video where Cindy talks about the lack of diversity in V.E. Schwab's The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Now, I haven't read the book, so I can't speak to that, but I would highly recommend watching Cindy's video, not only because she's ridiculously funny and one of my favorite booktubers, but also because she makes some serious points and raises some interesting questions about whether or not white authors should have the responsibility of writing characters of color. Another video on the topic that I'd recommend is Books Are My Social Life's video. Sajid rather eloquently presents a view on the topic that I find not only interesting, but I sort of agree with and will sort of delve into in this video. I'll leave a link in the description for the videos. Let's go into the question, shall we? First and foremost, my simple answer to the question is that writers should write whatever they want to write. I mean, we live in a free world. Everybody gets to do what they want. But there is a huge but, and we'll delve into that later. We can't really talk about this topic without taking a look at the publishing industry. Simply put, the publishing industry is an industry that caters to the white gaze. Don't believe me? Just take a look at the hashtag publishing paid me on Twitter for evidence. That hashtag showed that the industry values white voices over black voices and other voices of color. Just follow the money. This doesn't only mean that white authors get paid more than authors of color, but it also means that a lot of times white authors write stories that cater to the white gaze. This means that when they write characters of color, they often write them in a way that only serves to make them digestible or relatable to white readers. So instead of true representation, what you have is a bevy of tokenized stereotypes and caricatures of people of color according to what is digestible for a white audience. And this just perpetuates marginalization, and it's a festering ground for implicit biases. Again, you only need to look at the publishing paid me hashtag to see that the industry does center whiteness. This means that even when there is a demand for diversity, the demand is for diversity that is palatable for a white audience. And on the issue of white authors writing main characters of color, I will admit that I'm very conflicted because for the examples that we have, oftentimes it's not done correctly. Yes, I know early on I said people should write whatever they want to write, but the truth is that we don't exist in a vacuum. In reality, there's serious marginalization going on in the publishing industry. It isn't uncommon for an author of color to hear that we already have a blank book, so we don't need yours. It isn't uncommon for an own voice author to hear that their stories are not relatable, meaning that they aren't relatable to a white audience, again, catering to the white gaze. Simply put, it is a struggle for authors of color to have their works be seen on a large scale and accepted widely in the industry. So when a white author decides to write a main character of color, there are some serious considerations that they need to account for. I'd like to give the example of American Dirt. A white author essentially wrote a story about Mexican immigrants and she got paid millions for it. On the surface, there is nothing wrong with this. However, anyone who's been on BookTube will remember the outcry from readers about the problematic nature of the representation in that book. Essentially, the author took up space from a Mexican writer and got paid to inaccurately represent a community she barely knew. There are other examples for this being the case. What I'm simply saying is that because of how the industry works, when a white author decides to write a character of color, they are essentially becoming a mouthpiece for that character's identity, culture, or group. So if you are a white author writing a main character of color, will you be silencing a vital voice from that character's cultural group in doing so? I'm not saying that white authors should not write main characters of color. Again, I will point out that I have said that people can write whatever they want to. But what I am saying is that if a white author decides to write a main character of color, then they better be prepared to do their homework. Make sure you do your research, get sensitivity readers, and make damn sure that your character of color is not just created to satiate and cater to the white gaze. Make sure you give them appropriate agency, and make sure that your writing of that character of color does not perpetuate biases that people of that culture already face. You also have to consider what opportunities you might be taking away from authors of color when you write characters of color. What are you doing to make sure that you are using your privilege to redress the imbalance in the industry? Or are you just writing a character of color just for token points, just for profit, just because that is what the industry demands, that's what the trend is? It's very interesting to see the uproar from authors who say that they don't want to write characters of color because they don't want to get cancelled or because they don't want to make a statement on race. First of all, this evinces laziness on the author's part, and it reads like the author is saying that they are not willing to put in the hard work to get proper representation of a character of color, which leads me to my last point. Just because you decide to include a character of color in your work doesn't automatically mean that people who share an identity with said character have to accept and appreciate it. No one owes you that. It's completely their prerogative if they find your representation lacking and damaging, and just be prepared to cop that on the chin. Be ready and willing to accept criticism without going on the defensive. Let me be clear. Readers of color don't owe you gratitude or anything simply because you decided to include a character of color. It is very arrogant to assume that readers of color should just be grateful that you included a character of color and that they don't get to properly analyze that character's inclusion and get to be unhappy about it. It is a reader of color's right to want and have proper representation without you trivializing their concerns by calling it cancel culture. This is a whole other discussion for another day. Finally, I think the booktube community is asking the wrong question when we ask if white writers can write characters of color. At the end of the day, I will reiterate again that writers get to write whatever story they want to write. We need to reevaluate our understanding of diversity and our demand for it as readers. It doesn't make sense for all stories to have a cast of characters who all come from different backgrounds. Not for all stories. This is something Sajid talks about in his video, and I think he explains it better than I can. But I'm saying that books without inclusive casts might not be inherently bad, depending on the internal logic of the story. Again, back to Sajid's point. And if you crave stories with inclusive casts and diverse worlds, there's nothing wrong with that either, and it doesn't mean you have to like a book that doesn't have that. What I'm so ineffectively trying to say is that readers should redefine our request for diversity. For example, if you want a black story, go out there and find black authors. Why expect a white author to write a black story for you? Ask yourself, what is driving your quest for diversity? Is it because it's trendy? It's what everybody's doing now? Or do you really value different backgrounds and stories? Instead of asking if white authors get to write characters of color, ask why the demand for diversity automatically translates to white authors writing characters of color, and not the readers actively seeking out diverse stories from authors of color and supporting said authors. I know people will say it's hard to find authors of color to support in the industry, but I will challenge you to go outside of your comfort bubble and actively seek out and support authors of color. There's so many wonderful authors of color out there writing beautiful stories that don't center the Western perspective. Go and seek those stories from the source and stop incentivizing authors to write stories that they have no vested interest in, save for following the industry demand and gaining profit. To conclude, I believe there is true beauty in a story that has an inclusive world and a rich tapestry of diverse characters. Using the excuse of not wanting to be cancelled to not write diverse or inclusive stories is a bit of a cop-out, and authors who do this are denying themselves the opportunity to create something truly beautiful and to have a learning experience. But at the end of the day, authors should write whatever they want to write. But I also believe that we don't exist in a vacuum, and we must be prepared to face the consequences of our actions and be willing to learn and grow from them. And to people asking if white authors should write characters of color, I challenge you to ask yourself why the focus is on white authors writing characters of color and not on supporting authors of color telling their stories, if there really is a true demand for diversity. Thank you.